I am Diana, 32 years old, and I never imagined that my own mother would stand in front of 74 people at my grandmother's 90th birthday and announce, with a smile on her face, that my name had been removed from the family will entirely. What happened next, I could not have scripted. My sister began to cry, not out of sadness, but out of relief, pressing her hands together like she had just won something. And I stood there, holding a glass of sparkling water, realizing that the invitation I had received 3 weeks earlier had never been about celebrating my grandmother at all. Before I tell you what I did next, hit like and subscribe if you have ever been the family member who worked hard, stayed quiet, and still got punished for it. Because this story is for you. From the outside, my life looks like a straight line of good decisions. I grew up in Columbus, Ohio, the eldest daughter of Richard and Patricia Holloway. My father was a structural engineer. My mother was a woman who cared deeply about two things: how the family looked to the outside world, and whether my younger sister, Melissa, was happy. I learned early that those two priorities were intertwined. If Melissa was unhappy, the family looked bad. If the family looked bad, it was somehow my fault. I was 7 when Melissa was born, and I still remember the shift. Before her, I had been the kind of child my mother showed off at church, at school events, at the neighborhood 4th of July cookout. After her, I became useful in a different way. I was the one who watched Melissa while my parents went to dinner. I was the one who helped with homework, drove her to practice, covered for her when she came home past curfew in high school. I never resented her for it, not really. That is the thing about being the responsible one. You get so good at it that people stop noticing you are doing anything at all. By the time I was 25, I had a degree in accounting from Ohio State, a solid job at a mid-sized financial consulting firm in Cincinnati, and an apartment I paid for entirely on my own. Melissa, 3 years younger, had moved back home twice, dropped out of community college, and was currently working part-time at a boutique my mother had bankrolled without mentioning it to anyone until the checks had already been written. My father knew about it, he always knew. He just never said anything that might upset my mother. My grandmother, Eleanor Holloway, was the one person in the family who had always seen me clearly. She was sharp, funny, and entirely unbothered by what the neighbors thought. She had built a small but respectable rental property business after my grandfather died in the early 90s, and she had managed it herself until her late 80s. When I visited her, she asked me real questions about my work, my goals, what I was reading. She once told me, "Diana, you have more sense than everyone else in this family put together, and that is both a gift and a burden." I laughed. She did not. She also had a house, a 4-bedroom colonial on Maple Ridge Road that she had lived in for 41 years. She had told me, more than once, that the house was meant to stay in the family. She had shown me her handwritten notes about it, the way she planned to pass it down, the conditions she cared about. I was 28 the last time she and I talked about it seriously. She held my hand across her kitchen table and said, "You understand these things. I'm glad you'll be watching over it." I took that to mean she trusted me. I did not take it to mean I should check the actual legal documents. That was my mistake. The invitation arrived on a Thursday in early October. Cream-colored envelope, my grandmother's handwriting on the outside, though I later learned my mother had addressed all of them. A formal dinner to celebrate Eleanor Holloway's 90th birthday. 74 guests. The Riverside Banquet Hall on the west side of Columbus. Black tie preferred. RSVP by the 15th. I had not been to a family event in almost 2 years. Not since Christmas of the previous year, when my mother had announced at the dinner table that Melissa's boutique needed a small investment from the family and looked directly at me while saying it. I had declined, politely, and spent the next 4 days receiving texts from my mother about how I had always cared more about money than about people. I stopped attending events after that. Not dramatically. I just became unavailable. But this was my grandmother's 90th birthday. I called my closest friend from college, a woman named Renata, who had grown up in a family with similar dynamics and had the kind of clarity about these situations that I sometimes lacked when I was too close to them. She listened to me describe the invitation and then asked, "Why now? Why did they invite you after 2 years of distance?" I told her what I wanted to believe, that my grandmother had asked for me specifically. That turning 90 makes a person want the whole family present. That maybe my mother was finally ready to move past the tension. Renata was quiet for a moment. Okay, she said, but go in with your eyes open. I bought a new dress, navy blue, understated, the kind that said I have done well for myself without announcing it. I drove the 2 hours from Cincinnati to Columbus on a Saturday evening in mid-October with a card for my grandmother, a bottle of her favorite perfume, and what I can only describe as cautious optimism. The banquet hall was elegant in the way my mother always engineered elegance. Floral arrangements that cost more than they needed to, name cards in gold calligraphy, a slideshow running on a screen near the entrance, photographs of my grandmother across the decades. I scanned it from a distance and noticed, without fully processing the observation, that the photos from the last 20 years skewed heavily toward Melissa. I told myself it was because Melissa lived closer. My grandmother was seated at the center of the head table, looking remarkable for 90, dressed in a deep burgundy dress with pearl earrings. When she saw me cross the room toward her, something moved across her face that I could not quite read. Not quite surprise. Something closer to relief or perhaps sorrow. She took my hands in both of hers and said, "You came? Not how wonderful. Not I'm so happy. Just you came," in a voice that was quieter than her usual one. "Of course I came, Grandma, it's your 90th. She held my hands a beat longer than necessary, opened her mouth as if to say something else, and then my mother appeared at her shoulder. "Diana, you made it." My mother kissed the air near my cheek. Patricia Holloway had the posture of someone who had spent decades maintaining a performance. She was immaculate in silver gray. Her smile calibrated for public spaces. "We weren't sure you'd come. You've been so busy lately." "I made it work," I said. "Melissa is over by the bar. You should go say hello." She steered me gently but firmly away from my grandmother with the practiced ease of someone who had been redirecting me my entire life. Melissa looked expensive. That was the only word for it. She was wearing a dress I recognized from a brand that charged more per item than I spent on groceries in a month. Her husband, a man named Brandon who worked in real estate and had the particular confidence of someone who had never been told no, was beside her with a drink in each hand. "Diana." Melissa embraced me with more warmth than I expected. "I didn't know if you'd actually show up. Why does everyone keep saying that?" She laughed a little too quickly. "You know, you've been distant." "I've been busy," I said, which was true, though not the complete truth. Brandon shook my hand. He held eye contact slightly too long, the way people do when they are deciding what you know. "Good to see you," he said. Dinner was assigned seating. I found my card at a table near the back of the room, with a collection of distant relatives and family friends I barely recognized. The head table, where my parents and Melissa and Brandon sat with my grandmother, was at the front. I watched from my seat as my mother laughed and touched my grandmother's arm and refilled her water glass. Performing devotion in front of an audience had always been my mother's specialty. I ate my salmon and made conversation with a great-aunt from my grandfather's side who wanted to tell me about her recent knee surgery in more detail than I strictly needed. I scanned the room occasionally. At one point, I caught my grandmother looking at me from the head table, and she gave me a small, tight smile that I filed away to think about later. After dessert, my father stood to give a toast. He was a quiet man who only seemed fully at ease when he was talking about something structural, something with a blueprint. Public speaking made him stiff. He thanked the guests for coming, talked about his mother's resilience and her decades of hard work, mentioned her rental properties and her independence. He said she was the foundation of the Holloway family. He raised his glass. Then my mother stood. This was not, I would later understand, an improvisation. "I also want to take this opportunity," she said, her voice carrying across the room with the confidence of someone who had rehearsed, "to share some news that Eleanor herself asked us to announce this evening." She paused for effect. "As many of you know, Mother Holloway has been thoughtful about the future of her estate and her legacy. After many long conversations with the family, she has made some important updates to ensure her wishes are honored." Another pause. "The family home on Maple Ridge Road, as well as the management of her rental properties, will pass to Melissa and Brandon, who will continue the Holloway family legacy in Columbus." A murmur went through the room. "We are so grateful," my mother continued, for Melissa's commitment to being here, to showing up for this family year after year, to building a life rooted in community and connection. She looked at Melissa, who was dabbing at her eyes with a cloth napkin. That is what Eleanor has always valued most. I sat very still. 74 people were in that room. Several of them turned to look at me. I recognized the looks. Some were uncomfortable. Some were curious. One woman I did not recognize actually leaned over to the person beside her and whispered something. I did not cry. I did not stand up. I did not make a sound. What I did was look at my grandmother. She was staring at the centerpiece in front of her. Not at my mother. Not at Melissa. At the flowers on the table, her hands folded in her lap, her jaw slightly tight. It was the expression of a woman who had been told a version of a plan and was now watching a different version unfold. Something about that expression rearranged everything I thought I understood about the evening. My father caught my eye briefly and then looked away. That was the moment I knew he had not been entirely comfortable with this, and had not done anything about it either. After the toast, the evening moved on the way events do when everyone is pretending something uncomfortable did not happen. A cake was brought out. Happy birthday was sung. Photographs were taken. I moved through it with the kind of automated composure that comes from years of being the one who does not make scenes. As guests began to say their goodbyes, I found a quiet moment beside my grandmother near the windows, overlooking the parking lot. "Grandma," I said, keeping my voice low, "did you ask them to make that announcement tonight?" She looked at me for a long moment. "I asked your mother to handle the paperwork," she said carefully. "I did not ask her to announce it like a verdict." "The house. Was that your decision?" She was quiet. "I've been sick, Diana. More than I've let on. Your mother has been managing a great deal." She told me the documents were straightforward. She paused. I signed what she put in front of me. The chill that went through me was not anger. Not yet. It was the recognition of a shape I had not seen clearly until this moment. The way you sometimes do not see a pattern in a room until you back up far enough to take in the whole picture. "I need to make a call," I said. She nodded. She did not ask who I was calling. I think she already knew it was not a social call. I stepped outside into the cool October air and sat on a bench near the entrance of the banquet hall. I pulled out my phone and I called my father's older brother, my Uncle Gerald, who was a retired probate attorney and the only person in my extended family who had no financial stake in any of this. He answered on the third ring. "Diana. How's the party?" "Uncle Gerald," I said, "I need to ask you something professional. Tonight, if that's all right." A pause. "This is about the estate." "How did you know?" "Because your mother called me 6 weeks ago to ask if I'd be available to notarize some documents." I said I was retired and referred her to a colleague. I've been wondering what she was putting together. Another pause. "What happened tonight?" I told him. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he said, "Do you remember whether your grandmother ever mentioned the terms of your grandfather's original estate documents? Specifically, whether the house was placed in any kind of trust arrangement?" I did remember. I remembered it exactly because my grandmother had pointed to a file folder in her kitchen cabinet and told me the house was in a family trust that required the consent of all heirs to transfer. I had been 28. I had nodded and not thought about it again. "She mentioned a trust," I said. "Then what your mother signed with her is not necessarily the final word," Gerald said. "A trustee cannot unilaterally amend the disposition of trust assets just by updating a will. If the original trust documents established specific terms, those terms may still govern. The question is what those documents actually say. How do I find out?" County Probate Court. Trust documents, if they were filed properly, are public record. You can also go directly to the attorney who drafted them originally. "Do you know who handled your grandfather's estate?" I did. My grandmother had mentioned his name years ago. A man named Warren Shell at a firm in Worthington. I had no reason to remember it, and yet I had, the way you sometimes retain details that have no obvious relevance until the moment they become everything. "One more thing," Gerald said. "How is your grandmother actually doing, health-wise?" "She said she's been sick, more than she's let on." He was quiet for a moment. "Then someone has had access to a vulnerable elderly woman for an extended period of time. That changes the picture considerably, Diana." I want you to be careful about how you proceed, but I also want you to proceed because if what you're describing is accurate, this may go beyond a family disagreement about who gets the house. I went back inside and found Melissa near the coat check, alone for a moment while Brandon was retrieving their things. She looked at me with an expression that was half defiant and half something I recognized. The face she used to make as a teenager when she knew she had done something she could not entirely defend. I didn't know she was going to announce it like that, Melissa said. Mom planned all the details. I just knew about the documents. How long have you known? She hesitated. A few months. Did it occur to you to tell me? Mom said you wouldn't care. She said you had your own life and weren't interested in the family anymore. Melissa, I kept my voice level. That is what she told you. I need you to think about whether it's true. She looked down at her clutch. I have kids to think about, Diana. A mortgage. Brandon's business hasn't been stable. The house made sense for us. I'm not arguing that you don't need help. I'm asking whether you knew this wasn't entirely legal and did it anyway. She didn't answer. That was an answer. I drove back to my hotel that night and sat at the small desk near the window with my laptop open. I spent 4 hours going through everything I could access publicly about my grandfather's original estate, property records for the house on Maple Ridge Road, any liens or encumbrances on my grandmother's rental properties. What I found was consistent with what Gerald had described. The house had been placed in a revocable family trust in 1997. The trust named my grandmother as the primary trustee during her lifetime and specified that upon her death, the property was to be distributed equally among her grandchildren, with a provision that no single transfer of the primary residence could occur without written consent from all named beneficiaries. I was a named beneficiary. I also found something else. One of the rental properties, a duplex on the east side of Columbus that had been generating steady income for over 15 years, had been transferred to a limited liability company 18 months ago. The registered agent of that LLC was Brandon. I called Renata at 11:30 that night. Someone has been managing your grandmother's affairs and helping themselves along the way, she said when I finished explaining. This is not just a will dispute. No, I said, it's not. What are you going to do? I thought about what I had come to that party hoping for. Reconciliation. A seat at the table. Some acknowledgement that I was still a member of this family. I had been so focused on what I wanted emotionally that I had not been paying attention to what was actually happening. I'm going to do what I'm trained to do, I said. Over the next 10 days, I built a file. I requested the original trust documents from Warren Shell's firm, where a junior partner confirmed they were still on file and that the trust's terms had never been formally amended by a court. I obtained the property records showing the transfer of the rental duplex to Brandon's LLC, a transfer that had occurred without my knowledge or consent, both of which were required under the trust terms since I was a named beneficiary of the estate as a whole. I hired an elder law attorney named Patricia Osei, who specialized in cases involving undue influence over elderly clients, and I arranged to have a geriatric care specialist conduct a quiet assessment of my grandmother's cognitive capacity over recent months, something her own physician had documented concerns about but had never escalated. Gerald connected me with a colleague, a litigation attorney named Martin Cho, who reviewed everything I had assembled and told me flatly that what I had was not a family dispute. It was a case. The LLC transfer alone is potentially actionable, Martin told me. If your grandmother lacked full capacity at the time of signing, or if she was subjected to undue influence by individuals who stood to benefit directly, those transfers can be challenged and in some circumstances reversed. Add the trust violation regarding the house, and you have leverage in multiple directions. I don't want to put my grandmother through a court battle, I said. You may not have to. Sometimes the right letter to the right people produces a resolution without a courtroom, but you need to be willing to go to court if it comes to that. I'm willing. On a Tuesday in early November, 3 weeks after the party, I drove back to Columbus. This time I came alone. I had called ahead, telling my parents only that I needed to discuss something important about my grandmother's estate and that I was bringing her attorney. I did not tell them I was also bringing my own. They were waiting for me in the living room of my parents' house. My father sat in his usual chair looking older than I remembered. My mother stood near the fireplace in the way she always positioned herself when she wanted to control a room. Melissa was on the couch. Brandon sat beside her with the particular stillness of someone who had already spoken to his own attorney and had decided to wait and see. Martin Cho set a folder on the coffee table. "Let's talk about Eleanor Holloway's estate," he said. My mother smiled tightly. "I think Diana may have some misconceptions about what's been arranged. Everything was handled properly, with Eleanor's full knowledge and consent. That's what we'd like to explore," Martin said, "beginning with the original trust documents, which I have here, and which have not been amended by any court-recognized proceeding." He laid the first document on the table. "The trust governing the family home requires written consent from all named beneficiaries for any transfer. Diana is a named beneficiary. Her consent was not obtained. She wasn't involved with this family," my mother said, her voice hardening. "She chose to remove herself." Eleanor understood that. A beneficiary's estrangement from family members does not remove their legal standing under a trust instrument, Martin said. He was calm, the way very good attorneys are calm, the way that makes other people in the room feel like the temperature has dropped. What it means practically is that any purported transfer of the Maple Ridge Road property without her consent is legally void. My father spoke for the first time. "Patricia?" he said. Not a question. Just her name. My mother looked at him. "Did you tell me the documents had been reviewed by an attorney?" I said it was handled. "That is not what I asked." The silence in the room had a texture to it. Martin continued. He placed a second set of documents on the table regarding the rental duplex, the LLC, the transfer timeline, the questions about my grandmother's documented cognitive concerns in the months surrounding the signing. He was not accusatory. He presented it the way a structural engineer presents a load-bearing analysis. Here is what exists. Here is what it means. Brandon's expression did not change. Melissa had gone pale. "We're not here to pursue criminal charges today," I said. "That's not my goal. My goal is to correct what was done and make sure my grandmother's actual wishes are honored, not a version of them that was convenient for everyone except her and me." "You're going to destroy this family," my mother said. Her voice had lost its social veneer. "Everything I have done has been for this family." "What you did," I said quietly, "was use a 90-year-old woman's trust and her signature to move assets to yourself and your preferred daughter, without the legal authority to do it and without telling me. That is not for the family. That is for you." She opened her mouth. "Mom!" It was Melissa. She had been sitting with her hands in her lap and now she looked up. "Stop." Another silence. My father stood. He walked to the window. He stood there with his back to us for a long moment and then turned around. And for the first time in as long as I could remember, he looked directly at me. "What do you need from us, Diana?" Martin outlined the terms. The purported transfer of the house to Melissa and Brandon would be rescinded and the trust restored to its original terms. The rental duplex transferred to Brandon's LLC would be returned to the estate. A full accounting of any financial transactions involving my grandmother's assets over the previous 2 years would be provided to my attorney. My grandmother would be given independent legal counsel of her own choosing, separate from any family member's influence. And if any of these steps were not completed within 30 days, we would file in probate court and the matter would become public record. "And that's it?" Brandon asked. It was the first thing he had said. "That's the floor," Martin said. "Not the ceiling. Whether there are additional proceedings depends on what the accounting reveals." My mother was very still. She was not crying. She was doing what she always did when she lost control of a situation, recalculating, looking for the angle, the way back to a position of authority. But there was no angle here. The documents were what they were. "I'd like a few days," my father said. "You have 30, Martin replied. As we gathered our things to leave, Melissa followed me to the front door. She looked like she had been awake for several days. "I want you to know," she said, "that I am going to talk to Grandma. Myself. Without Mom in the room." "Good," I said. "I didn't understand what I was part of," she said. "I knew Mom was managing things, but I didn't ask the right questions. I told myself it was fine because Grandma wasn't objecting." "Grandma wasn't in a position to object clearly," I said. "That's the whole problem." She nodded. She looked very young in that moment, younger than her 29 years. "Are we going to be okay? You and me?" I thought about it honestly. "I don't know yet," I said, "but I'm not trying to burn everything down. I'm trying to put things back where they belong." She nodded again. I walked to my car. Everything my attorney had outlined was completed within the 30-day window. The house on Maple Ridge Road was restored to the trust. The duplex was returned to the estate. The accounting revealed no additional transfers, which was either true or meant that anything else had been handled carefully enough to be invisible, and we found no evidence of the latter. My grandmother was connected with an independent attorney, a woman from a firm in Dublin, Ohio, who met with her 3 times and confirmed that the original trust accurately reflected Eleanor's intentions, and that the recent documents had been signed during a period when her judgment had been, in her attorney's words, significantly influenced by the individuals managing her day-to-day affairs. My grandmother called me herself in December. Her voice was steadier than it had been at the party. "I owe you an apology," she said. "You don't," I said. "I do. I let myself be managed, and I let them tell me stories about you that I should have questioned. I knew you had pulled away, but I didn't push back hard enough on why." She paused. "I should have called you myself, a long time ago." "We're calling now," I said. We talked for an hour. It was the longest conversation we had had in years, and it felt like both of us were relieved to be having it. The family counseling was not my idea. It was Melissa's. She raised it in a text message to me in January, careful and tentative, acknowledging that she had participated in something harmful and that she wanted to understand how it had happened, not just accept that it had. I was skeptical. I told her I would think about it. What changed my mind was a conversation with my grandmother's independent attorney, who mentioned in passing that my grandmother had expressed a desire to see the family function with less machinery and more honesty in whatever time she had left. That was her phrase. Less machinery. It was such a precise description of how my mother had operated that I recognized it immediately as something my grandmother had chosen carefully. I said yes to 3 sessions. I said I would evaluate after that. The first session was painful in the specific way that honest conversations are painful when the people in the room have spent decades avoiding them. She was not accustomed to environments where her framing of events was questioned by someone trained to question it. The therapist, a woman named Dr. Anand, was patient and methodical and did not let anyone change the subject. My father, to his credit, said in the second session that he had known things were not right and had told himself it was not his place to interfere. "I've always thought that staying out of conflict was the same as being peaceful," he said. "I think I've been confusing silence with integrity." He looked at me when he said it, and I let myself believe he meant it. Melissa was trying. That was the most accurate description. She was not there yet. She still had reflexes built from 29 years of being the one who was protected, who was managed, who was given things so that she would stay agreeable. Unlearning that takes longer than a few sessions. But she was in the room. She was asking questions instead of deflecting. That was something. By spring, the family home on Maple Ridge Road was exactly where it had always been in the trust, waiting. My grandmother was still living in it, with a part-time caregiver who reported to her independent attorney, and she was, by all accounts, doing better than she had been at her birthday party. She called me every Sunday. I drove up one Saturday in April and we sat in her kitchen the way we used to, with coffee and the kind of conversation that does not need to perform anything for anyone. She told me about the neighborhood, about a cardinal that had taken up residence in the backyard. I told her about a project at work, a complicated audit that had required more patience than I usually had. At some point, she reached across the table and put her hand over mine the way she had at the party. But this time, without the tension, without the thing left unsaid. "I always knew you were the one who would figure things out," she said. "You gave me enough pieces," I said. "I just had to put them together." She smiled. It was the real one. The one that reached her eyes. I thought, driving back to Cincinnati that evening, about the version of myself who had arrived at that banquet hall in October with a navy blue dress and cautious optimism, who had wanted so badly to be welcomed back into a family that had already been deciding what to do with what was hers. That version of me had expected the evening to give her something. Instead, it had shown her exactly what was there. That is the thing about standing up for yourself that nobody tells you clearly enough. It is not about anger, though anger has its place. It is not about revenge, though there is a satisfaction in watching the truth arrive at a room that has only ever entertained comfortable fictions. It is about clarity, about refusing to let other people define the record of what happened, about being the person in the room who says, quietly and without apology, I was here. I counted. And what was mine was mine. The house is still standing on Maple Ridge Road. My grandmother's coffee is still strong. And every Sunday, my phone rings. If this story stayed with you, please like and subscribe, and share it with someone who needs to hear that standing your ground does not have to look like a war. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is make one very quiet, very deliberate call and let the truth do the rest. Have you ever had to protect something that was rightfully yours from the people who were supposed to protect it for you? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one.